So I'd like to introduce our Professor Emeritus, University of Illinois Springfield, Dr. Kent Redfield.
Good morning. We are really pleased today to be able to have the Director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget to talk to us about the state budget. I know that's on a lot of your minds. One note, if you did not pick up the one-page sheet that's sitting out there on the table, you might want to grab it on the way out. It is just a series of links to various reference materials about the state budget and the state's fiscal situation. So there's nothing that you need to read during the course of the next hour, but it is something that you might find useful. So our speaker today is Alexis Sturm. She is the Director of the Governor's Office of Management and Budget. She comes to that position from a senior position with the Comptroller's Office, Comptroller Munger. I won't read all of her experience and resume, except to note that in the time that she has been working in state government after starting out as a Dunn Fellow, she has worked for 5 governors and 4 comptrollers, and that's pretty much everybody since Edgar, if you're keeping track. And so we're really pleased that she is here today to talk about the state budget.
All right, good morning. Assume this works. So thank you for having me here. As Kent mentioned, I've been doing budget work for a really long time, and it does get a little bit in the weeds, so not very often do people want you to come and lecture them for 45 minutes, and so you get me, and I hope it's interesting. As I said, thanks for welcoming me here. This is really early, so I know some of you were probably up watching basketball a little late last night. Still managed to get here. I appreciate that. So as Kent mentioned, I've been in Springfield since 1997. So I grew up in Carbondale, and then I've been in Springfield since I came here as an intern. And, love Springfield, glad to be here. So. And also, as we mentioned, six different budget directors I've worked for, not including myself. I won't count myself. And 5 governors and 4 different comptrollers. So it's been kind of an interesting 20 years, and it's been a good learning experience all that time. So Governor Pritzker was inaugurated on January 14th of 2019, so just 2 months ago. And he had to introduce his first budget proposal on February 20th, which was just about 5 weeks after he started. So we kind of hit the ground running and had a lot to do. And what we're going to do here is just kind of the overview of the budget proposal. There are a few hard copies of this proposal, but it is also up on our website if you're interested in having a printout. So, all right. So the governor's budget proposal was basically, as he kind of laid out in his inauguration, is we're trying to meet the challenges of Illinois' 3rd century, right? We've got 200 years in Illinois. We've done a great job creating a wonderful place to live, but where are we going to go? So his goals are to restore economic and budgetary stability to the state, create a world-class education system that's accessible to all, strengthen Illinois' social service network, reform the criminal justice system and invest in public safety, rebuild and expand Illinois' infrastructure, and make Illinois a world leader and competitive in the global economy. All right. The all-funds budget that was introduced on February 20th was $77 billion. It's grown by a few dollars since I started. But the biggest portion of the funds are the general funds. The state's got about over 700 active funds in the state treasury, so it does that gets kind of lost when you start talking about the budget detail. But usually what we're talking about is the general funds, but that's about half the budget. By result area, we spend our largest amounts on healthcare, education, human services, pensions, and government services. When you get down to the general funds, that's mostly where the state's income taxes and sales taxes go. That's about 3/4 of your total revenues into the general funds. The estimated revenues for the general funds in fiscal year 20 is $38.9 billion, with an estimated expenditures of $38.75 billion. On the spending side, our largest areas of expenditures are education, primarily K-12, but also higher education, pensions, healthcare, and human services. The governor's spending priorities are early childhood programs, those that are aimed at birth to age 5, K-12 education, higher education, health and social services programs, criminal justice reform and public safety, and then infrastructure investment. Birth through 5 is early childhood. So the governor proposed a $100 million increase in the early childhood block grant. There had been about $50 million increases the last few years tied to a federal grant that we had applied for, but the governor identified that this is one of the key areas of investment in order to get children ready for school. It kind of pays pretty large dividends down the road. So he would like to allocate an extra $50 million a month above that baseline into early childhood. He also proposed to expand the Childcare Assistance program. This helps working parents or those who are going back to school. He would like to raise it to families up to 200% of the federal poverty level would receive assistance from the state for childcare. This would be a $30 million increase. There's an increase in early intervention funding, and then there's a federal preschool grant that we have included in the budget. On the K-12 education side, there is an increase in the evidence-based funding model. If you guys have been following state finance the last few years, there was a pretty big overhaul in the K-12 funding formula. That's been increasing about $350 million a year. That goes through the formula and gets allocated to the higher needs school districts. The governor would like to put a little bit extra into that above kind of what the expectation is at this point to increase that by $375 million. He has proposed an increase in ISB's career and technical education grant line. That line had been basically flat for over 10 years, but that's another area that he would like to have some additional funds allocated to. And then he proposed establishing an AP test, low-income test fee waiver program that would cost about $2 million. And then there was an increase in funding for educator misconduct investigations. Higher education. Higher education has struggled in recent years, probably the last 2 decades. So the governor has stated a goal of increasing MAP funding, that's the Monetary Award Program, by $200 million or 50% over the next 4 years. This is the first year the down payment on that. It's a $50 million increase, which is about 12.5%. We include funding in there for the second year of the AIM High pilot program, which is aiming at trying to keep high achieving high school students to stay in state to go to college. The pilot program is this year, so this would add the second year of that program. And then there's a 5% increase in operational funding for public universities and community colleges. And then there's a competitive grant program for student support services included in the budget. Department of Human Services is one of our largest agencies that does social service programs. So this is where the Childcare Assistance program is in here. Not only is there an increase in the coverage from 185% of federal poverty level to 200% in the proposed budget starting January 1st, it also has a ramp out to allow families to stay in the program as their incomes go up to 215% of FPL. The Department of Human Services continues to operate under a number of consent decrees that drive a lot of the spending, and so there's additional money, $31 million in there for 700 new placements for individuals with developmental disabilities who are going to less restrictive, more community-based settings under the latest consent decree. Right before the budget was proposed in February, there was an enactment of a phased-in minimum wage increase, so there's additional funds in the budget to address those wage pressures that might occur at Department of Human Services, and increases the Home Services Funding Program to recognize caseload growth. And there's some underfunding in 2019 that we're kind of annualizing into the 2020 numbers. Department on Aging, their largest program is the Community Care Program, which provides direct home help to seniors to help them stay at their homes longer. So that increase for fiscal year 20 is estimated to be $65 million between minimum wage increase and utilization increases. There was a new law passed last year to provide a $200 payment to community care or case coordination units to pay them $200 per Medicaid application that they help seniors apply for. So there's money in the budget for that, but that's a new cost this year. And then we've moved some fund appropriations around. Other human services agencies, we've increased funding for DCFS. The proposed increase will allow DCFS to hire 126 additional direct service staff, including child protection specialists and child welfare specialists. There's a federally mandated IT program that DCFS has to begin implementation of, so the first year cost of that's estimated to be $25 million. There is $6 million in the budget to Department of Public Health to address new lead screening cases that are expected. They dropped the actionable level for lead screening from 10 some deciliters per milliliter or something like that to 5. And so there's going to be more cases that are going to require some action, so there's additional money for that. And then we are expecting the Chicago Veterans Home to finally open this year. This has been under construction for many years, but that's supposed to open in the spring of 2020, so there's $20 million in the budget to staff up and operate that. Healthcare and Family Services is one of our largest state agencies. This is the agency that runs the state's Medicaid program. There's somewhat limited liability growth expected for Medicaid that we're able to kind of manage with some other state funds outside of the general funds. But we do have some funding in there for some additional staff for them to improve their collections and cost avoidance and recoveries, but also to improve management under the 1115 behavioral health waiver. And then we're also proposing, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but a new assessment program that'll put some additional funds into DHFS's budget. On the criminal justice side, the governor signed an executive order for justice, equity, and opportunity that Lieutenant Governor Stratton is going to be spearheading. That is to work to try to improve fairness and equity in the criminal justice system. We do have some increased funding in there for community-based violence prevention programs that should help. And then we continue to have increased funding for Department of Juvenile Justice to try to improve the outcomes at that agency. On the corrections side, corrections came under a consent decree in December of 2018 to cover medical care for inmates in the correctional facilities. So there's additional funds in there for the electronic medical record system. There's $25 million to put that in place, but that'll help improve the quality of care for those who are seen in the facilities, because it'll be able to follow them among the different facilities and keep electronic records. Everything was still on paper. There's also funding in there for the Joliet and Elgin treatment centers. There's a consent decree under the Rasho consent decree to try to improve treatment of those with mental health challenges in the facilities, so there's additional funding for that. And then they're also doing another IT system that they call Offender 360, so that will have the final build out this year. Illinois State Police, we have funding for 2 Illinois State Police cadet classes in there. There were no cadet classes for the State Police during fiscal year 16 and fiscal year 17 during the impasse. So they're still a little low on their trooper numbers, and so we have additional funds in there to do 2 additional classes there. And then the governor signed Public Act 100-1178, which is the firearm dealer license certification program, so there's funding in State Police's budget for that. And then we also have funds for a conservation police trainee class for Department of Natural Resources. So all of you have lived in Springfield for a while, so you know kind of what's been going on in the state's fiscal situation. I mean, there's been some challenges been going on for a number of years, but the budget impasse during 2016 and 2017 really kind of made that situation a lot more challenging. The backlog increased during the impasse from about $5 billion to about $16.7 billion. The state's credit rating was downgraded 8 times. Late payment interest penalties from the impasse totaled over $1 billion. And so there's kind of just this challenge here on the fiscal side that we continue to face. Even with the recent changes in 2017 to the tax rates, the state is still facing a structural deficit. It was estimated to be about $3.2 billion for fiscal year 20. The governor feels very strongly that the structural deficit cannot be addressed by spending cuts alone and is trying to take a broader approach to addressing that structural deficit. And so he's looking at revenue changes and a different approach to the payment of the state's pension commitments. One of the cornerstones, which the governor's talked about quite a bit in the last few weeks since the budget address, is the call for the fair income tax system. He is pushing for a constitutional amendment that will allow the state to change its tax structure. 33 states in the federal government all have graduated income tax rate structures, and only 9 states that tax income tax it at a single rate. So this is kind of a map that illustrates the states that have these graduated rate structures. However, the governor recognizes that this amendment can't be voted on until November 2020, and so that's still at least a year and a half away. At this point, it's a year and a half. And so he has recognized that there's a need for additional revenues in the fiscal year 2020 budget. So we've proposed about $1.1 billion in additional revenues that will benefit the general funds budget. If those didn't get passed for some reason, then there's going to have to be cuts from this budget proposal and cuts in spending. This is kind of a quick little outline of the revenue changes that were proposed in the budget. A lot of them have kind of been discussed in the press in recent weeks, so I won't go through them for too much. But one is to decouple from the federal tax credit for repatriated corporate income. There was a change at the federal level last year that gives a credit to corporations who repatriate offshore income. And so we are recognizing that federal credit when we take the federal AGI as our base for taxable income. So we're proposing to decouple from that. We've proposed 3 changes that will go directly support the Medicaid program, the largest of those, that MCO assessment on managed care organizations, but also a cigarette tax increase, and then the taxation of e-cigarettes at the same rate as other tobacco products. There were a few changes to existing rate structures, including phasing out the private school scholarship credit, creating a progressive tax structure for video gaming, and then capping the retailer's discount. On the new revenue side, the governor's proposed taxing sports wagering, creating, since the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court has allowed states to do this, there are a few states that have moved into this market. And so the governor would like Illinois to join them and start taxing sports wagering. The governor's also been supportive of adult use cannabis, in different, some level of adult use cannabis being legalized, so there's revenues tied to that. And then he also proposed a new plastic bag tax. In addition to those changes, we've also talked about doing a fiscal year 20 delinquent tax payment incentive program, which really accelerates revenues forward from other years, but it helps ensure compliance for people who are behind on paying their taxes. All right, on the pension side, this is a graph here of the projected state retirement contributions. And so the gold line, which is the bottom line that is nice and smooth looking, that is what was expected to be the pension contributions at the time the pension funding plan was enacted in 1994, which was 25 years ago. And so in that original plan, there was supposed to be a gradual ramp up to 2010, so a 15-year ramp up, and then after 2010, there'd be this level percentage of payroll contribution that would look nice and smooth like that. The gray line and the blue line is what it actually looks like. So the gray line is what we've actually paid over the last 25 years, and then the blue line is kind of where we're going. And then you can see in 2045, there's supposed to be a large cliff. And so when the state gets to 90% funded in 2045, there'd be about a $17 billion drop in pension contributions that year. The impact of the recessions and then the related change in the rate of return assumptions that the retirement systems have done since 2010 has really shifted the ramp. So you can see we actually followed it okay the first 10 or 15 years. We did put pension bonds in there in 2003. There was a little drop in 2006 and 2007, but we were kind of following the line. But as those asset values dropped by it was 20 or 30% in 2008 and 2009, and then at the same time the retirement systems dropped from an assumption of an 8.5% rate of return down to 7 or 6.75%. It's really steep, made that curve go a lot steeper. Even during the same time that we've also created Tier 2, which is a lower pension benefit system for employees hired after 2011. So even though we were supposed to have a fairly level curve, we've actually had a 9% increase every year, or on average since 2010. That's about $500 million a year. So the governor's got a proposal out there to try to manage that commitment. And so his approach to pension stabilization, taken collectively with the expansion of the state's tax base and the ongoing investment in priorities that will help grow our economy, will put the state on a sustainable path that keeps its promises to its retirees going forward. One part of the proposal is to dedicate a portion from the fair income tax when it becomes enacted in 2 years on top of the certified contributions from the retirement systems. He would also like to extend the current pension buyout program. We are in the first year of the program, but we'd like to extend that. Infuse the system with additional assets from the issuance of new pension funding bonds in the total of $2 billion. And he has created 2 task forces, the Pension Asset Value and Transfer Task Force, which is going to look at state assets and see what of those we can maybe either allocate to the retirement systems or sell things that we don't need anymore and put that value into the state's pension systems. And then he's also created a task force to look at pension consolidation. This is primarily on the smaller municipal funds. There are about 600 small pension funds, primarily for firefighters and police, but we're looking at consolidating those and hopefully realizing some savings there. And then finally, he is proposing to restructure the pension debt to make the payments more sustainable by modestly extending that end of that ramp, so that year where it's going to have the drop off by 7 years to fiscal year 2052. This is where we really get into the numbers, and I won't walk you through too much here just because it's a lot of numbers. But the general fund's revenues are estimated to total $38.9 billion, which is about a 4% increase over the fiscal year 19 revised base estimates. However, that's going to reflect some money that's moving around. So there's some changes there where some cigarette money would go directly into the Medicaid program so that they could manage their cash flow a little bit better outside of the general funds. So that's the numbers there. We do not have interfund borrowing proposed for the fiscal year 20 budget. They have used interfund borrowing the last couple of years to try to provide some cash flow relief to the general funds. On the expenditure side, the fiscal year 20 general funds budget has estimated expenditures totaling $38.748 billion. You can see there's primarily increases in higher education and human services and public safety, which reflect the governor's priorities. And then there's an estimated surplus with that estimated spending of about $155 million. This is more for my bond friends in the financial community, but this is our tentative timeline for issuing bonds this year. We are working on that April 2019 bond sale. We do expect to price that next week, which is going to provide bond proceeds for those pension acceleration buyouts. SCRS has seen some interest from people over the last few months to basically, I'll walk through it real quick, but if you're in the process of retiring, you can choose a lower cost of living adjustment at the time you retire in exchange for a cash payment up front. So these bonds will go to fund some of those payments. TRS and SURS are working on that program as well. They have not had as much participation. TRS has not had as much participation yet, but the bulk of their retirements are in May and June. But we are doing some funding for that, and we're also going to refund some bonds too to save some additional money. But then we have some other bonds that we're looking at, including those pension bonds next year. We do propose creating a new bond structure. The state primarily issues general obligation bonds and Build Illinois sales tax bonds, so we're proposing to create a new individual income tax bond, which will kind of bring down the interest rate costs for the state, and then we would use those potentially for that pension funding contribution. Right. The capital budget, the proposal that the governor laid forth in February was a very baseline maintenance budget. There is some discussion going on to do a larger capital program this year, but this is just kind of the baseline needs. With capital appropriations, there will be an appropriation up front for a large project, but that's going to spend out over many years. So even though there's this $17 billion in total capital appropriations, you would not expect that to spend in any one year. But the governor did propose $3.7 billion in new capital appropriations. That's primarily for the road program, for IDOT. EPA does water revolving loans, and that's primarily what that's for. And then Capital Development Board, we did propose a $750 million lump sum for deferred maintenance. The state's facilities are in need of a lot of work, so there would be some money in there for higher education, for community colleges and universities for their deferred maintenance, but also for some of the state's facilities. All right, that just kind of goes through what I just said. So the state's deferred maintenance backlogs, ballpark, are at least $23 billion just for state facilities, higher education, and K-12. It doesn't include what IDOT's running as their maintenance backlog. But we have some pictures here of some of what some of our facilities look like. We do run mental health facilities. We run a bunch of correctional centers. And so a lot of them are in need of improvement there. And there's some of our universities. And then the one on the left there is the Coliseum out at the fairgrounds. Statewide deferred maintenance needs do increase by about $500 to $700 million a year. The state owns probably thousands of buildings all over the state, and so there's just a real need to kind of do an investment in those facilities. All right. We do have our budget book. I imagine this is on that handout, but our budget book is up on our website. We've also added a new interactive budget portal if you're interested in taking a look at that. So, all right. And that's it. Got it?
And yes, thank you very much. And we have about, the director has to go to a meeting. We've got about 15 minutes to do questions. Then you have to put up with me for the next 15 minutes beyond that. And I believe Bob has a microphone, so any things involving budgets are all fair questions. The director's not obligated to tell you why the governor won't tax retirement income, but the things involving the budget, she'd be happy to try and clarify.
I see Bill back there. Bill and I used to work together years ago, so he's a budget office alum as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Hi, Alexis. Good to see you again.
Mm-hmm.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Under Governor Rauner, 2-3 years ago, One of the actions the state took was they implemented that new administrative fee on sales tax collections, which had never been there before.
Right.
At the same time, the state also began retaining some of the LGDF, local government distributed fund income taxes cities would normally get. And that was happening with all municipalities up and down the state. Is there any plan to undo what, of course, we would consider a harmful action of installing that administrative fee and keeping some of the income taxes that cities had always gotten? For us, I think it was first year was 10%, which was over $1 million. I think that's down to 5% now, but right now with municipalities, you referenced earlier pensions and what that's doing to the state. You know that it's doing the same thing. Police and fire pensions are a huge obligation for cities like Springfield and something we're concerned about as well. So any dollars that we can get from the state, especially the ones we've always gotten, we would like to see those returned. Are there any plans or discussions about that?
At this point in time, I have not had any conversations about the administrative fee. I do know that's come up legislatively from time to time. At this point, that is covering a lot of the operational costs of the Department of Revenue. So obviously, if there was an adjustment there, that's a pressure on the state's budget. As I kind of laid out, we still kind of have a problem. And the same thing with the local government money. Now, I will remind you that we did switch LGDF from having to go through the General Revenue Fund and experience the cash flow delays there. So the cities and the counties are getting their payments out of LGDF a lot quicker now. At this point, the governor's budget proposal does hold them flat in fiscal year 20, but there are several revenue changes that the governor's talked about here. And also the fair tax proposal, which would provide additional revenues to the local governments. And he also has that task force to help, that will hopefully help some of the pension costs there.
Alexis, one of the immediate criticisms from Republicans when this budget came out was that it's all more spending and higher revenue and not really cuts. Where does this budget proposal reduce expenditures from the enacted FY19 budget?
So I will say that this is what I would consider to be a maintenance budget. I think the last 4 years show that nobody's looking for draconian cuts in state government. The governor has kind of ruled that out. I mean, he's talked about, you know, we could do these large cuts, but these are all services we all kind of depend on. There are some controls in the growth in spending that you're not going to see in a walk down like this. And so, you know, we asked the agencies for maintenance budget requests. A lot of those came in before I was in the office, but, you know, my staff reviewed those and there was a lot of saying no. But one of the things that we are doing is we are addressing the step increases for AFSCME and for the other unions that didn't have step increases for the last 4 years. And so as those costs get annualized into the budget, that's a lot of that in there. There were some areas of shortfall in fiscal year 19 on the human services side that we're addressing those as well. But there's not much in the way of expansions. The governor feels like this is a bridge budget to a lot of things that he would like to do, but he did ask to allocate some additional funds to education, higher education, and human services. And then we do have like those state police cadet classes in there.
I know the director has a tight schedule. If there's one more question, pardon?
I'm glad you brought up maintenance budget. The old state capitol looks like heck. If you look up at the columns, they needed to be repainted 10 years ago. Can we have any assurance that the old state capitol will be fixed?
So the rankings for deferred maintenance are run through the Capital Development Board. My office does work on that. There is a prioritization for health safety. We do run a lot of 24/7 facilities where we have people that we're taking care of, so that's kind of been the priority for deferred maintenance. However, you know, I grew up in Illinois. I love all the historic sites here. You know, I came here as a young child and went to all the Lincoln sites, and my hope is that we're going to be able to address some of the deferred maintenance needs in the overall bigger capital budget and kind of take care of some of those issues. But this is all over the state. It's a maybe. Yeah, I don't have specifics on the priorities right now, so.
I think we cut her. I think that's it. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you.
And again, the one-page sheet, two-sided, that was sitting on the table, it has the link to the PowerPoint that she just did, along with links to information from the Civic Federation's proposal, the Illinois Policy Institute's proposal, the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago, and the Center for Tax and Budget Accountability. So if you want to look at some alternative ways to go about solving Illinois' budget crisis, then there's plenty of material there. Let me make a couple of quick points, and then we can see what else people want to talk about. You cannot overstate the mess that we are in. $3.2 billion of the budget is the current budget is in deficit. So maintaining what we did this year in a balanced budget situation requires an additional $3.2 billion, and we're not looking at nearly that much in revenue growth. We have $8 to $9 billion worth of unpaid bills, and so if you want to balance the budget. Let's balance the budget, which is the Illinois Policy Institute's approach. You're having to generate at least $4 billion in continuing revenue or cuts and $9 billion in one-time spending if you would like to just be clean and whole in terms of the end of the next fiscal year. So we are in a huge hole. This is what you just saw is a bridge to get to a graduated income tax, which has a current price tag of $3.4 billion worth of additional revenue to put into the system. So anybody that's talking about solving the budget problems, at least in terms of what we have in front of us from, again, those other watchdog groups, is going to involve some kind of 2 to 3 year transition, because the Illinois Policy Institute, the Civic Federation, and the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club of Chicago all depend, in terms of balancing the budget with their proposals, on changing the pension clause in the state constitution, which, again, you would not benefit from those changes until the spring of 2021. So we've got 2 years of trying to keep our head above water in terms of any of the proposals that are out there. So this is not a good situation to be in. The governor is suggesting one way to go about it. You should note that none of these plans really involve starting to pay down the unpaid bills until you get into fiscal year 2021. I mean, this is really just holding on. Again, if the other alternatives that are sitting out there are taxing retirement income either in whole or in part, which would generate between $1 and $2 billion a year. We're talking about doing taxing services, which is only at best about a $500 million increase in terms of addressing this, or then we're talking about budget cuts. And so the Illinois Policy Institute has not updated their proposal from last year, but essentially by balancing the budget through cuts, we're talking about abandoning the school aid formula, the evidence-based model, to take about $3 billion out of proposed education spending over the next 4 to 5 years, cutting healthcare insurance employee healthcare costs by about $700 million a year, shifting about $1.8 billion of normal costs that the state pays for pensions, employer costs for school districts to the school districts, and then passing a constitutional amendment that would allow you to reduce pension expenditures by about $1 billion a year. So can you cut your way out of this mess? If you are willing to do those kinds of, and again, I recommend you go look at the Illinois Policy Institute's website and get their 2020 plan, and you can get an idea of the scope of what a cuts-only kind of budget would require. So I didn't, like I said, I just want you to, and the second sheet that there is just my quick back of the envelope kind of summary of the various approaches that are being presented, and so I don't, those are a fairly good representation. The director and I would disagree about cuts a little bit in terms of, they're talking about $700 million worth of reduction in healthcare spending, but according to economic and fiscal projections of what we ought to be having, it's more like they're assuming they can get $1 billion out of healthcare cuts. So, and those are all with soft numbers. So, these are not 100% all of the features, but I think they're a fair presentation of what it's going to take to fix the budget, whether we're going to go with the governor's plan or we're going to talk about the Civic Federation or the Commercial Club of Chicago, the Illinois Policy Institute. We are in a real hole. If you do this, if you talk about $3 billion of deficit each year in terms of maintaining without new revenue, you've got $12 billion of unpaid bills to go on top of $9 billion of unpaid bills. So we can keep doing we can spend last year's money and just run up the, run the credit card, and it would be $21 billion, which is in the hole, which is even more than we were at the height of the budget stalemate. It is not a good situation. So on that cheery note, do people have questions that I can help with or refer you to in terms of how we deal with this? Yes, sir.
The Illinois seems to be taking advantage of all the federal money that's available to states through the various programs.
Yes, the state is aggressive in terms of trying to get federal money in terms of matching grants. The problem is that we want to do a capital program, but the days of which you could put up, 25% or 10% state match for federal dollars are gone. The current administration is adamant about reducing Medicaid money coming in and making it and adding requirements that make it harder to qualify. So we're not in a friendly environment in terms of capturing federal dollars either for health care or for transportation, and we're looking at an explosion of the federal deficit in terms of the impact of the tax changes instituted 2 years ago. So we're as aggressive as we can be, as is every other state, but what's going on at the federal level is a contraction of what used to be available in terms of federal assistance. Yes? Sure.
Was about highway funding, roadway funding.
Okay.
It looks like the presentation fell short of that
Yeah.
component, which is a huge component.
Yeah, and that is, so capital is a different, is not general revenue fund, and we're balancing the budget in terms of general revenue fund. Capital program, the operating engineers 150 just put in a proposal for a big expansion of surface transportation, not public buildings, that required a doubling of the motor fuel tax and basically a pay-as-you-go. So we've got huge unmet needs, and then we have to find a way to pay for it in terms of motor fuel tax, or in terms of Illinois lags other states in terms of what it costs you to register your car, what it costs for a license. I mean, we did a lot of Build Illinois money out of increasing what people paid to the Secretary of State to keep their car on the road. And so, there are certainly options out there, including eventually, if we're all electric cars, we got to tax mileage. But short term, people electric cars will probably pay a bigger, more to register their car. But so and that doesn't touch water, and that doesn't touch public buildings. So a bonding program allows you to get a lot more bang for your buck out of. Rather than doing a pay-as-you-go. But when we have the lowest credit rating in the country, that means we pay a lot of money to borrow money, even though these in effect would be revenue bonds rather than general obligation bonds in terms of that. So it's, if we get a capital bill, it's going to be, we're going to have to find some way to pay for it. Everybody's in favor of spending money, and we know the needs are there, but it's going to require some hard choices. You could take the sales tax off of motor fuel tax to reduce the price at the pump, since you pay sales tax on gas that goes into the general revenue fund. But if you do that, then you'd have to make it up somewhere else, which would be taxing services. So there's nowhere to hide in terms of how we do this. So is the governor in favor of that? Yeah, I'm pretty sure he is, that he wants a capital plan. Everybody wants to cut ribbons, in addition to having all those unmet needs. But this is a huge ask to put all of this on the table, and they're trying to get the constitutional amendment on the ballot now, rather than let the opposition to graduated income tax build up until next spring. So there's the amount of things that we're going to lay on the table in front of the General Assembly this session is going to be stunning. All of those people that are new members that really wanted to get to the legislature, welcome to the job. Okay, in back, yes. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you comment on the specifics of the graduated tax, where it looks like it's not a straight linear increase according to income that the governor came out with, where it jumped from
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So we've got governors. This is about the governor's decisions in terms of the graduated income tax, in terms of how he's structured it, in terms of the proposal that's out there. There's a public finance answer to that, and there's a political answer. So the public finance answer is that, if you're going to get X amount of revenue, then you can construct all kinds of roads to get there. If you are trying to sell a graduated income tax as a fair tax that does not raise taxes on 97% of the population, then you have a large area of below $250,000 where you're basically got a little bit of tax relief or flat, and then you pile it all in at the top end. The federal system does that with a lot more divisions and a lot more exemptions. So, there's all kinds of ways to get to X amount of dollars. But if you are trying to present it politically, particularly when we're selling concepts, putting this on the ballot is not voting for the governor's proposed graduated income tax brackets. Putting on the ballot is giving the legislature the permission to do this. And the most effective negative ads you're going to see, I think, against this are not that the governor's numbers don't add up, but that do you trust the legislature? Do you trust politicians with this authority to raise taxes? Whereas the current system, if I raise taxes on the big guy, I got to raise taxes on the little guy, and I can't raise taxes on individuals more than a ratio of 8 to 5 in terms of corporations. So there are controls in the flat tax and the way it works, that you can understand why corporations and wealthy individuals don't like the idea of a graduated income tax. So it's, does it do the numbers add up? Does it generate enough money? We just had back and forth between the Illinois Policy Institute people and the governor's office about, dynamic scoring and what basis we're using. And, they're, so the numbers are always squishy, and it's always a projection. So that's so from a public finance standpoint, it doesn't matter how you get there, as long and although there certainly are principles that would say this is a fair or more equitable way to do it. From a political standpoint, the more that you can make this look like a tax on only 3% of the population, the better off you are politically. I think that's fair. Okay. Other questions? Yeah, and the alternative proposals that deal with retirement income, those are all. We can do those tomorrow. The proposals that deal with pensions, those have to be a constitutional amendment, and that is not a done deal. If you pass a constitutional amendment removing language that says pension obligations or pension benefits are a contractual obligation that can't be diminished, or then you are going to have a federal lawsuit involving the contract clause of the federal Constitution that states cannot diminish contracts. And there's a lot of case law out there suggesting that the courts have not been sympathetic towards states trying to impair contracts, particularly contracts that they make with other entities, or in this case, individuals. So the idea that if we amend the Constitution to limit the pension clause, that's suddenly going to allow us to start fixing the budget, I don't think that's realistic. I think that would be tied up in the courts almost immediately. And so they're just, again, the easy answers are just not there in terms of this. Okay. Again, I would be happy to discuss any of this that are on those pages. And again, look, if you go to the websites and look at the plans, they're out there, and you can, you don't have to read all of them, but you can get a sense of what are our options in terms of dealing with the mess that we're in. So with that, thank you very much for your attendance.
Very good. Thank you, Kent.